is a special presentation of HBO Sports. There are prize fights that assume mythological proportions and worldly significance because they reflect and sometimes influence forces beyond the ring. Johnson, Jeffries. A turn-of-the-century racial conflict between an irreverent black athlete and a beloved white champion. Lewis, Schmeling. At the dawn of World War II, a showdown that represented the battle between democratic ideals and Nazi intolerance. Ali, Liston. In the civil rights 60s, a free-thinking young champion embraces a threatening religious sect between fights with a terrifying opponent. Frazier, Ali. During the Vietnam War, an electrifying event that mirrors a deeply divided country. We examine the stormy atmospheres around 4 historic battles.
In this corner, boxing's historic battles.
Hello, I'm Jim Lampley. This edition of In This Corner examines 4 historic heavyweight championship fights, each of which can ultimately be seen as something much greater than a prize fight. 4 events which marked their times, which remain embedded in our national lore and memory, as much for what happened outside the ring as in the ring. We lead off with a drama that revealed America's darkest heart. Early in the century, it set off race riots. Much later in the century, it resonated still via a famous Broadway play and then a movie, The Great White Hope. Jack Johnson against Jim Jeffries, at a time in America when most still took white to mean right as well as might. It was staged in Reno, Nevada, because no other place would have it.
In this corner, Jack Johnson versus Jim Jeffries.
On the plains of the Sagebrush State, the white man and the Negro will settle the muted question of racial superiority.
Nevada historian Philip Earle.
Somebody once said that in the first 3 decades of this century, that the only social event that was bigger than the Johnson-Jeffries fight was Lindbergh's flight to Europe and then his return to the United States. It was big. It was important.
It came during an era when heavyweight champions routinely refused to fight black contenders, a practice started by the original American heavyweight champion, John L. Sullivan, in the 1880s. But on December 26, 1908, a Canadian-born champion, Tommy Burns, agreed to fight Johnson in Australia, and Johnson, to the dread of American fans, captured the greatest title in all of sports. Boxing historian Bert Sugar.
This was not a changing of the guard as it had been when Corbett beat Sullivan, or when Fitzsimmons beat Corbett, or even when Jim Jeffries beat Fitzsimmons. This was a rupture of the total chain. A black man had beaten a white man.
Professor of history Julian Bond.
This white nation needed a white champion to represent it. The person who's going to stand at the top of this pinnacle has to be reflective of the nation. Johnson certainly wasn't.
While Jack Johnson celebrated and traveled the world, the frantic search began for the man who could return the title to the Caucasian race. Boxing historian Hank Kaplan.
They started what was then known as the White Hope campaign. Kids came off the farms and out of the lumber camps, the mining camps, for a spot among the White Hopes. Just about all of them failed. At least none of them seemed to have a shot at Johnson. And so the only hope left was the previously retired Jim Jeffries, who had not had a glove on in 6 years. He was the hope of the people who wanted a change.
Bert Sugar.
Jack London, writing for the New York Herald, wrote, "One thing remains. Jeffries must emerge from his alfalfa farm and remove that smile from Johnson's face. And then, as if to add an emphasis, he said, "Jeff, it's up to you."
Despite Jeffries' long absence, the adoring public truly believed that the former undefeated heavyweight champion was still unbeatable, still the strongest man in the world, a living legend. Boxing historian Earl Gustke.
His friends told a story of Jeffries in 1902, 1903 as a relatively young man on a hunting trip in the Tehachapi Mountains near Bakersfield, California, killing a deer and carrying it on his back 9 miles to his campsite without stopping once. He was just a phenomenal physical specimen.
At age 35, living in Burbank, California, and weighing more than 300 pounds, Jeffries, physical specimen no more, embarked on one of the greatest comebacks in boxing history.
Less than 1 year before the bout, Jeffries took all that weight off, went into extremely hard training, got his body back in shape, and weighed 227 for this fight. So physically, he looked as invincible as he did 6 years prior to that when he was champion.
And most Americans desperately wanted to believe that Jeffries was still their champion. Because at a time when it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry or cohabitate, the ebullient Johnson flaunted his disdain for custom and convention. Author, historian, Randy Roberts.
One night he was tired. He walked into a hotel and requested a room. It was a whites-only hotel, and a white hotel manager looks up to him and says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve your kind here." Johnson repeats it, "May I have a room?" "Sorry, we don't serve your kind here." Jack Johnson laughed and says, "You're mistaken. The room isn't for me, it's for my wife. She's one of your kind."
This irrepressible son of a slave used the power and visibility of the heavyweight championship as any man might, which was seen as liberating by blacks and dangerous by whites.
Jack Johnson was part of the first generation of blacks born free in the United States. He's born after the Emancipation Proclamation at the tail end of Reconstruction. I think he was probably the first truly emancipated African American and would absolutely refuse to accept the dictates of white society. If he wanted to drive fast cars, he was going to do it. If he wanted to date and marry white women, he was going to do it. In their own more limited ways, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were talking about some sort of emancipation, mostly economic, political emancipation. Jack Johnson wanted it all.
And so the monumental Johnson-Jeffries showdown was arranged for Independence Day, July 4th, 1910. Jeffries was the instrument not of independence, but of dependence.
Here's a fight originally scheduled for San Francisco. Great political pressure is brought to bear on the governor of California. The fight's shifted out of California and goes to Reno. Reno is viewed in 1910 as kind of an eyesore in America. It's a place that allows open gambling. It's a place that allows open drinking. It's considered the divorce capital of the world.
I'm on my way to Reno. I'm leaving town today. Give my regards to all the boys and girls along Broadway. Once I get my liberty, no more wedding bells for me. Shall sing the battle cry of freedom.
And suddenly, the evil forces, the minions from around America descend upon Reno. Gamblers, hitmen,